Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. In part one of this series, we discussed the root causes for the Jewish tribe's hostility with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Muslims, and ended with a background on Banu Qurayzah and turn of events up until their betrayal and defeat of the Confederate army. As indicated, politically charged critics have used the event of Jewish tribes in early Islam, especially the Banu Qurayzah, and a rather large number of them killed as a pretext to criticize Islam and the Muslims, to demonstrate Muslims' animosity with the Jews as a historic one, with some even calling Islam antisemitic. But at the same time, marginalizing the actions of the Banu Qurayzah and not even considering the context, such as the Confederate War. In this lecture, we continue to show that the Banu Qurayzah were killed because of what they did, not because of who they were. And we will also take a closer look at the numbers in this lecture. To that end, even the most spiteful of critics cannot academically and rationally say that these Jews were killed because of who they were. In other words, there is absolute zero evidence of it. In fact, all the things that happened to the three tribes we discussed was not because of who they were, but rather because of what they did. We now continue with what happened next. As indicated in the part one of this series, which I strongly recommend those who have not listened to, please do so first. In the first part, we looked through the majority of reports and biographies regarding this incident and have relied on the most common reports, leaving out the inconsistencies, irrelevant details, and implausible reports. With this short intro and the background presented in part one, the Banu Qurayzah upheaval, based on our further research and analysis of accounts, along with the Quranic verses and without conjectures, revolves around the following facts. The Jews of Banu Qurayzah broke their treaty of peace and cooperation with the Muslims. When the enemy attacked Medina, they betrayed the Muslims and the rest of the community by colluding with the enemy, aiming to destroy the young Muslim community. In doing so, they knowingly signed their own death warrant, considering the second treaty. As such, their greed and arrogance, along with provocations from the Banu Nadir's exiled Jews, caused them to sell out their Muslim allies in hopes of gaining victory over the Muslims and overtaking the leadership of Medina. Keep in mind, our focus is not the Battle of Ahzab itself, rather what happened before, during, and after as far as the Jews are concerned. As the Ahzab army retreated, hence the defeat of the Jewish conspirators from Banu Nadir and Khaybar and the Jews of Banu Qurayzah, along with the leader of the conspirators, Ibn Akhtab, all retreated to their fortress and apparently thought that through resistance they could eventually achieve victory and continue with their life of treachery in Medina. However, according to Waqidi's Kitab al-Maghazi, Volume 1, considering past experiences, the Prophet, peace be upon him, saw the Banu Qurayzah as an imminent threat to the Muslim community, one whose treacheries and continued treaty violations could not be ignored. Therefore, he mobilized his men toward their fortress. As Salam ibn Meshkam, a Jewish man from Khaybar, put it, quote, he, Muhammad, is a man who will not fight unless he is being strangled. Furthermore, the Muslims could not leave the Banu Qurayzah issue unresolved, as they were worried the Banu Qurayzah would join other Jewish tribes in alliance with the Quraysh, whose leaders, Abu Sufyan, had already threatened to return to Medina with a larger army. Hence, Muslims could not allow repeat of what happened with confederates. Furthermore, Prophet, peace be upon him, sent delegations to them before the war, so they had plenty of chances to stop. Keep in mind, with Banu Qurayzah, it was not about just breaking a promise as some would like to portray. It was rather about what happened that resulted in breaching the treaty. It was about the group that physically fought Muslims before they retreated to their fort. It was about their collusion with the enemy. It was about their instigation along with Banu Nadir leaders. It was about galvanizing and uniting Arab tribes from north and south to form the Confederate Army. And it was about the threat and treachery Banu Qurayzah presented. As the Quran reminds the Muslims of this great trial in chapter 33, remember when they came at you from above you and from below you, and when eyes shifted in fear and hearts reached the throats, and you assumed about Allah various assumptions. There the believers were tested and shaken with a severe shaking. The Quran paints a dire and frightful picture of this event. According to Tabari's commentary, they came at you from above you refers to tribes of Banu Qatafan and Banu Fazara from north, who were incentivized by the Jews of Banu Nadir, promising them lands and date palms from Khaybar. And from below you refers to Quraysh and other tribes of Mecca from south, whom the leaders of Banu Nadir united. Another interpretation is that they were fully surrounded by the Confederate army. Or also you could say from above could mean the Banu Qurayzah from their fortress above in Medina, and the Confederate army from outside below. As a result, Muslims were horrified, as if their hearts reached their throats, while they were tested and shaken. According to some reports, Banu Qurayzah even threatened to slaughter Muslim women and children from inside, while Muslim men were to go outside to fight the Confederates. Hence, the Prophet, peace be upon him, had to send them to Banu Haritha's fortress in order to protect them. Some reports also indicated few Banu Qurayzah men even attempted to harm them while they were in that fortress. As Muslims surrounded the Quraysh fort, a cold war ensued as both sides exchanged accusations. At this point, Banu Qurayzah had a chance to surrender and show remorse. However, instead, they held a fighting posture as Banu Qurayzah men started shouting profanity, insulting the Prophet, his wives, and the Muslim leaders. And then one of their leaders said, "There's no treaty between us. I tore it up like I tore up this," as he pulled his shoestrings out and tore it up with his hands. And then said, "There's only this between us," pointing to his sword. Before long, arrows and stones were shot from the fort above and arrows shot from below by Muslims. As a result, the Prophet laid siege to the Qurayzah for several days. There are reports that Banu Qurayzah started looking at their options, We have no confirmation of this because there were no Muslims there among them, but in short, the reports say none of the options seemed practical to them, so they proposed to surrender if the Muslims let them leave, like Banu Nadir. Given their long resume of evil deeds, the Prophet told them it must be an unconditional surrender. In despair, they finally stopped and surrendered. As the Quran says, and those of the people of the book who aided them, the Quraysh, Allah did take them down from their strongholds and cast fear into their hearts, so that some you slew and some you made prisoners. Again, some you slew refers to those who were killed in the battle, a fighting encounter, if you will, between the two. Although some reports have said that some you slew refers to those who were executed. More on this later. In fact, when they surrendered, they asked the Prophet, "What are you going to do with us?" The Prophet said, "Nothing. I am going to leave your judgment to a person of your choosing." After all the things they had done, the Messenger of God amazingly forgoes his prerogative and allows a person of their choosing to judge them. According to Ibn Hisham's Sirah, volume 3, they then sent word to the Prophet saying they would accept the judgment of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the chief of the Aus tribe of the Ansar, as he was their ally in pre-Islamic days. They felt that he was bound to be lenient toward them, just like Abdullah ibn Ubay interceded on behalf of Qaynuqa Jews when he sought their release by the Prophet. Upon Qurayzah's request for Sa'd's judgment, the Prophet gave instructions for him to be brought in. On his way, his tribesmen, the Aus, tried to persuade him to be lenient. They said, "Be kind to your allies. The Prophet is lenient on them, hence allowed them to choose you, and now that you have been chosen to judge, be kind and lenient to them." He replied, "I will be fair and just." As Sa'd approached the Prophet's tent, the Prophet said to those who were with him, "Stand up to greet your leader." This was to give Sa'd extra respect in his position as judge and to make his judgment binding. When he sat down, the Prophet said to him that the Qurayzah had agreed to accept his judgment in their case. Sa'd said, "Will my judgment be binding on them?" He was answered, "Yes." He asked again, "And on all who are present," meaning the Muslims there? Again, he received a positive answer. He then turned to the Prophet, peace be upon him, lowering his face out of respect, and asked, "And you as well, the Messenger of God?" He responded, "Yes." According to few unconfirmed reports, which are quoted by critics, Sa'd then said, "I hereby rule that all the men of the Qurayzah are to be killed, their properties to be divided, and their women and children to be taken as prisoners or captives." According to the same reports, at the Prophet's orders, trenches were dug in the marketplace, and the Qurayzah's adult men were brought there with their hands tied. They were all executed. According to these same reports, they constituted somewhere between 600 to 700 men. Huyy ibn Akhtab was among them, remaining faithful to his promise to stay with them and share their fate. Their young men below the age of puberty were spared. However, according to Ibn Hisham's Sirah, volume 2 and Tabari, volume 2, Sa'd said, "I hereby rule that those of the men of the Qurayzah who were involved in plotting and fighting are to be killed, and all men who had no role in the fighting and treachery, and the women and children to be spared. Hence, it can be concluded that a limited few, such as Ibn Akhtab, along with several conspirators, were killed or executed according to Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's ruling, who was after all chosen to be the arbiter by the Banu Qurayzah. And Tabari also mentions this in his commentary of verse 33:26, that according to Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, those found guilty were executed and those found innocent were freed. Regarding the captives, there's no reason why the Prophet, peace be upon him, would not act as stated in verse 47:4, which says, "Bind a bond firmly on them. Thereafter is the time for either set them free by grace or ransom, until the war lays down its burdens." In addition, according to Waqidi, Kitab al-Maghazi, Volume 1, the Prophet, peace be upon him, freed some of the captives and put others to work. Ibn Hisham Sirah, Volume 2, mentions few names as examples, such as Ibn Rafah, who did not participate in the fight and was freed. Same man is mentioned in Tarikh al-Tabari, Volume 2. Same thing with Amr ibn Su'da, who told his companions that he would never scheme against Muhammad. Young adolescent men like Atiyah al-Ghurayzi were freed. Some whole families were freed, like the family of Zubayr ibn Bata, and even their possessions returned to them. Now, regardless of numbers killed, which we will discuss next, the following facts remain regarding the Banu Qurayzah's event. The facts critics conveniently leave out or overlook. Number one, even now it is an internationally accepted rule that if there is a signed agreement or treaty of peace and cooperation between two nations, and a war breaks out with a third nation, they must unite, cooperate, and come to each other's aid as allies. It is abundantly clear what would happen to the one who breaches, not only by not cooperating, but also by explicitly announcing their breach and announcing their allegiance and collusion with the enemy, and actively joining the enemy camp to fight their ally. Is this not treachery or treason? What would be their fate? Today, many nations have even an implicit treaty of peace and cooperation among themselves, especially those who are strategic allies to one another, meaning that if one gets into a war, they come to aid of each other by either actively fighting along with the side of each other or providing financial material support. Even in an individual level, if a citizen of a nation plots against his or her country with the enemy or shares sensitive information with the enemy camp, especially at the time of war, he or she will be tried as one who has committed treason or sedition, let alone if this person is an active member of the military and obviously will immediately be court-martialed, and no one would call it injustice. You can see for yourself the penalty in U.S. Code Title 18, Chapter 115, titled Treason, Sedition, and Subversive Activities, where sections 2381 through 2390, which deal with treason, rebellion, or insurrection, sedition, conspiracy, advocating overthrow of government, activities affecting armed forces outside and during the war, and so forth. Number two, some Jewish scholars, not Israelis, have commented against Banu Qurayzah, one of whom is Israel Wolfensohn, a Jewish writer and historian, in his book History of Jews in Arab Territory. On page 142 he writes, "It was essential that the Jews of Banu Qurayzah not make such grave mistake by acknowledging to the Quraysh elite that worshipping the idols is better than worshipping one God as in Islam. Furthermore, seeking refuge with idolaters. The Quran has called out this action by some of the Jews who united the Quraysh and Qatafan against Islam, as the Quran says." Then he quotes the Quran, "Have you not seen those to whom portion of the book was given, believing in idols and false deities, and how they say of those idolaters who disbelieve, these are more rightly guided than those who believe." So then Wolfensohn calls this, describes it as a grave mistake. Number 3, Sa'd ibn Mu'az was the judge or arbiter chosen by Banu Qurayzah, not Muslims. Hence, whatever the ruling, it came from Sa'd, not Prophet peace be upon him. Number 4, Sa'd's ruling was based on the Torah, Deuteronomy book 20 verses 10 through 14, even though when it came to application of it, the Prophet peace be upon him applied leniency as discussed based on Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi reports and Tabari's commentary. However, keep in mind, had the Jews defeated the Muslims in a reverse situation, they would have applied the Torah ruling word by word, killing all the men, not just the fighting men, and then taking women and children as plunder. Number 5, a number of Jewish men of Qurayzah were killed during an actual fight before their surrender, as verse 33:26 confirms. These men fought with Muslims outside of their fortification. Some were killed and the rest retreated to their fort. Number 6, the ruling of Sa'd, therefore, was in line with justice, with international law, and with Torah. An act of justice by Muslims which occurred among backward Arabs of Arabia 1400 years ago, one that is still valid and considered just by international laws and criteria at any scale. One that Muslims should be proud of. Now, a closer look at numbers. Firstly, given the books of Sirah are based on very first reports of events that occurred in Prophet's time, were actually written over 100 years after the Prophet, we cannot be absolutely certain of their accuracy without research and due diligence, especially on certain events like Banu Qurayzah, where we see exaggerations, oddity, inconsistency, and what appears against the Quranic text. I neither am nor want to be apologetic, but rather seeking the truth based on factual evidence and critical thinking. Up to recent centuries, most of the scholars and narrators of history have skimmed through this event with little interest, challenge, or diligence. Beyond the points I listed above, there have been many contemporary scholars and historians who, through research, examination of various reports, references, and the Quranic verses, have concluded that considering the typical population of those days in typical cities such as Medina, especially parties involved in this event, the magnitude of the reported number of killing or the numbers killed, which according to various reports, mainly from Ibn Ishaq, is 600 to 700 or 900, is dubious, as well as inconsistent with those of similar events, hence peculiar and raises many thought-provoking points and valid questions that any sensible person who reads the biography, history, and the reports might ask, such as the following. Number one, some sources such as Al-Tirmidhi in Kitab al-Sayr, Nisa'i, and Sunan al-Kubra and Musnad have reported the numbers killed to be 400. Number two, Ibn Ishaq reports Sa'd ibn Mu'adh ruled that men of Banu Qurayzah be killed, as did other historians or biographers, which is what the Torah commands in Deuteronomy. However, in Sahih Bukhari, the narration says the fighting men must be killed, which is also confirmed by other reports. Number three, what about the Quranic verse 33:26, which states some you killed and others you took captive? This clearly refers to a real combat, a physical fight where some were killed and some were captured. Otherwise, if it were not during the battle, all would have been killed or all would have been captured. The term taqtulun comes from the word qital, which means physical battle or physical war, in which the word ta'sirun means you captured, which are not in a condition where there is a surrender. Hence, from the verse we understand there was a physical fight where some of them got killed and some taken captive. Number four, not only a mass execution of 600 to 900 is not understood from the Quranic verse at all, but also intellectually, even in that time, it is highly unlikely, because no matter how guilty of treachery and collusion with the enemy, not all the Banu Qurayzah men conspired and were at fault, hence must be punished. Also, what about the older men or disabled men? As the original Ibn Ishaq report says, all men of this tribe were executed. Number five, wouldn't such killing be reflected with more points, coverage, and reminders in the Quran as well as in authentic reports, as was done for the Battle of Badr, where only 70 Qurayshi men were killed? Number six, what about the home of the woman from Banu Najjar? According to some biographers, such as Ibn Hisham Sirah, volume 3, after the men of Banu Qurayzah surrendered, they were brought to her house to be imprisoned before they were executed. Her house surely could not have been large enough to accommodate 400 men, let alone 600 to 700 or 900 men. Number seven, even if we say 600 to 700 men were executed as reported, and that it was not by the ruling of Prophet but Sa'd's, it still raises a question that, considering Prophet's mercy as graciously demonstrated throughout his life, a man who would not kill anyone unless forced, as demonstrated when he conquered Mecca and forgave lifelong enemies who tortured, killed, or exiled Muslims, and he executed none, which are all non-deniable facts. How could he then agree to a ruling of such mass execution in spite of Sa'd's ruling? Hence, this would not agree with the Prophet's seerah, tradition, and political disposition. Furthermore, it's not to say the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not just, but it is to say killing 600 to 900 men, some guilty, some not, is not consistent with وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We have not sent you, O Prophet Muhammad, except as a mercy to people of the world. Number eight, the number of men killed by some report was 400, by some 600 to 700, while others claim up to 900. Which is it? And none of these reports or none of these numbers are aligned with the detailed events, nor are consistent with other related reports. For example, if we assume even 400 men were killed, that would have created such fear and concern among the remaining Jews that they would have immediately left Medina as a result. While we know that after the Banu Qurayzah's upheaval ended and Medina was calm, the Jews continued with their businesses and trades for quite some time without any disturbance. Number 9, according to Ibn Hisham's Sirah, Sa'd then said, I hereby rule that all the men of the Qurayzah who were involved in plotting and fighting are to be killed, and all the men who were not involved, as well as the families who disagreed with their treachery, and all the women and children to be spared. Hence, it can be concluded that a limited few directly involved, such as Ibn Akhtab, along with several conspirators, were killed or executed according to Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's ruling. And Tabari also mentions this in his commentary of verse 33-26, as we said, that according to Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, those who were found guilty were executed and those found innocent were freed. Number 10, regarding the captives, as we mentioned, there is no reason why the Prophet, peace be upon him, would not act as stated in verse 47:4, which says, bind a bond firmly on them. Thereafter is the time for either set them free by grace or ransom. In addition, according to Waqidi's Kitab al-Maghazi, volume 1, the Prophet, peace be upon him, freed some of the captives and put others to work. Ibn Hisham's Sirah, volume 2, mentions few names as well. For example, Ibn Rafa, who did not participate in the fight, was freed. He's mentioned in Tarikh al-Tabari, volume 2 as well. Amr ibn Sauda, among many others. Young adolescent men like Ati ibn Qurayzi were freed. Some whole families were freed, like the family of Zubayr ibn Batara, and even their possessions returned to them. Therefore, the reported numbers seem highly dubious, with probability of the reported mass killing of Banu Qurayzah by some Muslim biographers being a likely story developed by Jewish descendants who perhaps pretentiously converted to Islam, nevertheless reported by Muslim writers who did not make any attempt to validate these reports or claims through investigation of multiple sources and events, as suggested by Sayyid An-Nas, and we'll get to that. Many of the reports published later were based on Ibn Ishaq's report. This is why Imam Malik ibn Anas criticizes Ibn Ishaq, who was one of the early biographers and the one who interviewed these Qurayza descendants and basically reported what they claimed without due diligence. According to Uyun al-Athar by Sayyid al-Nas, Imam Malik said, while Ibn Ishaq is trustworthy in many cases, why did he go to the Banu Qurayza descendants to gather information for his reporting, where they tend to be biased and imply their forefathers were courageous, heroes, and perhaps wronged in their biased reporting? Imam Malik said their words do not have historic credibility, and even called Ibn Ishaq a liar who reports from liars. For example, in their reporting, the descendants of Banu Qurayzah portrayed their forefathers as courageous when they said Jews were courageous as they faced death. And one can see an example of their courage in what Huyay ibn Akhtab said to the Prophet when they brought him in for execution, and the Prophet looked at him and asked, O enemy of God, didn't God defeat you? And Ibn Akhtab responded, yes, I swear, but I did not regret being your enemy. I was seeking honor and went everywhere searching for it. Allah humiliates whom He wills. Then he turned around and told his people, O my people, don't be sad. This is a hardship that Allah has decreed upon us, the Bani Israel. Meaning, we are the victims and have been as children of Israel. Imam Malik is referring to such rhetoric and criticizing Ibn Ishaq for reporting such lies without due diligence. Another example of such report lacking historic credibility is the one reported in the book Rasul Khatam Volume 2, narrated by Ibn Hisham Sirah Volume 3, which report that after the upheaval of Banu Qurayzah ended, Muslims distributed their possessions as the spoils, and then some of their women and children were captured and given to a man by the name of Sa'd ibn Zayd Ansari, who took them to Najd to sell them and purchase horses and weapons with the money. This report contradicts the prophetic hadith an-Nabawi, which says the worst people is the one who buys and sells people. Furthermore, this report is not consistent with the report from Waqidi that says the Prophet set free some of the captives and put others to work, as we mentioned in point number 10 above. In the end, looking at all three tribes, not only the numbers killed seem dubious, the claim that these men were killed or exiled because they did not accept Islam or because they were Jews or Islam is anti-Semitic are untrue and absurd. There were other Jews who never converted but coexisted with the Muslims peacefully. They were never coerced to accept Islam nor killed for being Jews. Furthermore, for all the events that occurred with Jewish tribes of Medina, especially Banu Qurayzah, any act of compassion and mercy we see belong to the Prophet, peace be upon him. 1, he allowed them to have a judge other than himself. 2, an arbiter of their own choosing. 3, his leniency to reduce their penalty by killing only the fighting men and those involved in the conspiracy. Not all men as the Torah commands. Recall, Sa'd judged according to Deuteronomy 20, chapter 20, verses 10 through 14. Furthermore, he did not take women and children as plunder according to the Torah's command and Sa'd's ruling, but rather set free some of the captives and put to work some others. There were other non-Muslim tribes, some of whom were even idolaters, who had treaties with the Muslims and lived in peace with them. The Jews could have been part of these communities as they were in the beginning. But when they instigated sedition and conspired against the Muslims, their allies, and the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, who was also a statesman, he then had no choice but to respond. All three were warned through delegations who visited them multiple times, yet they decided to continue with their treachery at different levels and multiple times. Regarding the number of Jewish men killed from Banu Qurayzah, well, given above facts, you be the judge. As mentioned, one is not considered apologetic when one seeks the truth based on factual evidence and critical thinking. As for the curious and the politically charged critics, the critics we talked about, we say rather than using these events, especially the Banu Qurayzah and the numbers killed, as a pretext to criticize Islam and to show Muslims' animosity with the Jews as a historic one, please consider the facts we mentioned first in this series. including the context, which is the Confederate War and its precursors, without trivializing the actions of the Banu Qurayzah, which is neither fair nor academic. You will then realize one cannot rationally say that they were killed and expelled because of who they were. I challenge you to bring any evidence for such a claim. Regarding the numbers, if after listening to above facts, above thought-provoking points and valid questions, if you're still convinced the 400, 600 to 700 or 900 to be the numbers killed, then you might ask, is that not harsh? I would say yes, but is it true? On the other hand, if given the above facts, points, and the valid questions, you conclude these numbers are odd and dubious, so do I. However, as mentioned, regardless of numbers, one thing is for certain and factual throughout all the reports, and that would be their treachery, enmity, wickedness, and audacity of the Banu Qurayzah, backed and motivated by Banu Nadir's leaders, who incurred such punishment, any punishment, based on the reasons presented earlier. Referring to Banu Qurayzah's defeat, we might also add that day not only marked the humiliation of the Jews in Medina, but also the weakness of hypocrisy. Therefore, the hypocrites were reluctant to continue with their earlier trickery. Moreover, the idolaters no longer thought of attacking the Muslims in Medina. In fact, it was the Muslims who now had the ability to go on the offensive. Events therefore moved in such a way that led to the fall of two main cities in Arabia, Mecca and Ta'if, to Islam. It may be said that the actions of the Jews in Medina, the hypocrites, and the idolaters of Mecca were interlinked, and that the expulsion of the Jews from Medina put an end to such affiliations. The whole episode hence marked a totally new stage in the history of the Muslim state. Above analysis are facts about the mentioned Jewish tribes based on presented evidence, along with the critical analysis and contrasting of known realities in Prophet's time and his biography, without getting into too many details, moral lessons, etc., due to limited time and the purpose of this lecture series. As I indicated, in this past century or so, there have been several new researches and investigations conducted regarding the Banu Qurayzah event. With ending of our lecture material at this point, as an example of such research, I would like to read a few excerpts from a paper written by W.N. Arafat titled New Light on the Story of Banu Qurayzah and the Jews of Medina, from the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland, published by Cambridge University Press. According to Ibn Ishaq in the Sirah, the third of the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayzah sided with the Qurayshis and their allies, who made an unsuccessful attack on Medina in an attempt to destroy Islam. This, the most serious challenge to Islam, failed, and the Banu Qurayzah were in turn besieged by the Prophet. Like Banu Nadir, in time they surrendered, and they were subjected to the arbitration of Sa'd ibn Mu'az. A number of he's talking about Sa'd ibn Mu'az, which was a member of the Aus tribe. He ruled that the grown-up males should be put to death and the women and children subjected to slavery. Consequently, Trenches were dug in the marketplace in Medina, and the men of Qurayzah were brought. They were brought in groups and groups. Their necks were struck. Estimates of those killed vary from 400 to 900. On examination, details of the story can be challenged. It can be demonstrated that the assertion that 600 or 800 or 900 men of the Banu Qurayzah were put to death in cold blood cannot be true, that it is a later invention, and that it has its sources in Jewish traditions. Indeed, the source of the detail in earlier Jewish history can be pinpointed with surprising accuracy. The Arabic sources will now be surveyed, and the contribution of their Jewish informants will be discussed. The credibility of the details will then be assessed and the prototype in earlier Jewish history pinpointed. The earliest work that we have with the widest range of detail is Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, his biography of the Prophet. It is also the longest and the most widely quoted. Later, historians draw and in most cases depend on him, meaning Ibn Ishaq. But Ibn Ishaq died in 151 after Hijrah, i.e. 145 years after the event in question. Later, historians simply take his version of the story, omitting more or less of the details and overlooking his uncertain list of authorities. They generally abbreviate the story, which appears just as one more event to report. In most cases, their interests seem to end there. Some of them indicate that they are not really convinced, but they are not prepared to take further trouble. On multiple authorities, then there's one authority, Ibn Hajar, however, denounces his story, and the other related ones as odd tales. A contemporary of Ibn Ishaq, Malik, the jurist, denounces Ibn Ishaq outright as a liar, just for transmitting such stories. It must be remembered that the historians and authors of the Prophet's biography did not apply the strict rules of the traditionists, those dealing with hadith. They did not always provide a chain of authorities, each of whom had to be verified as trustworthy and as certain or likely to have transmitted his report directly from his informants. So he's saying that Ibn Ishaq did not make the attempt to investigate. He just reported directly from his informants and so on. And he will get into that. The attitude toward biographical details and toward the early events of Islam was far less meticulous than their attitude to the Prophet's traditions or indeed to any material relevant to jurisprudence, law. Indeed, Ibn Ishaq's account of the siege of Medina and the fall of the Banu Qurayzah is pieced together by him from information given by a variety of persons he names, including Muslim descendants of the Jews of Qurayzah. Ibn Ishaq sets out his direct sources as he opens the relevant chapter on the siege of Medina. These were a client of the family of Az-Zubair and others whom he did not suspect. They told parts of the story on the authority of Abdullah ibn Ka'b, Malik al-Zuhri, Asim ibn Umar ibn Qatada, Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr, Muhammad ibn Ka'b of Qurayzi, and others among whom he mentioned. Each of these contributed to the story so that Ibn Ishaq's version is the sum total of the collected reports pieced together. At a later stage, Ibn Ishaq quotes another descendant of Qurayzah, Atiyah by name, who had been spared, and directly a certain descendant of Zubayr ibn Bata, who was the prominent member of the tribe of Qurayzah, who figures in the narrative. The complacent attitude is one of accepting the biography of the Prophet and the stories of the campaign as they were received by later generation, without the meticulous care or the application of the criteria which collectors of traditions or jurists employed. It was not necessary to check the veracity of authorities when transmitting or recording parts of the story of the Prophet's life. It was not essential to provide a continuous chain of authorities or even to give authorities at all. This is obvious in Ibn Ishaq's Sirah. On the other hand, reliable authorities and a continuous line of transmission were essential when law was the issue. This is why Malik, the jurist, had no regard for Ibn Ishaq. One finds, therefore, that later historians and even exegetes either repeat the very words of Ibn Ishaq or else abbreviate the whole story. Apart from mild complacency or doubtful acceptance of the story itself, Ibn Ishaq as an author was in fact subjected to attacks by scholars, contemporary or later, on two particular accounts, and he mentions those. One was his uncritical inclusion in his seerah of so much spurious or forged poetry. The other, his unquestioning acceptance of such a story as that of slaughter of Banu Qurayzah. His contemporary, the early traditionist and jurist Malik, called him a liar who transmits his stories from the Jews. In other words, applying his own criteria, Malik questioned the veracity of Ibn Ishaq's sources and rejected his approach. Indeed, neither Ibn Ishaq's list of informants nor his method of collecting and piecing together such a story would be acceptable to Malik, the jurist. In a later age, Ibn Hajar further explained the point of Malik's condemnation of Ibn Ishaq. Malik, he said, condemned Ibn Ishaq because he made a point of seeking out descendants of the Jews of the Medina from Banu Qurayzah in order to obtain from them accounts of the Prophet's campaign as handed down by their forefathers. Ibn Hajar then rejected the stories in question in the strongest terms. And then he quotes him, says, such odd tales as the story of Qurayzah and Nadir. Then the author continues, against the late and uncertain sources on the one hand and the condemning authorities on the other, the Quran must be set the only contemporary and entirely authentic source. Then he goes into there, the reference to Surah 33, verse 26 is a very brief one. He calls those of the people of the book who helped them, meaning Quraysh, to come out of their forts. Some you killed and some you took prisoner. And then he says, the commentators and traditionists simply tend to repeat Ibn Ishaq's tale, but in the Quran the reference can only be to those who were actually in the fighting. This is a statement about the battle. It concerns those who fought. Some of these were killed, others were taken prisoners. Then the author continues, one would think that if 600 or 900 people were killed in this manner, the significance of the event would have been greater. There would have been a clearer reference in the Quran, a conclusion to be drawn, and a lesson to be learned. But when only the guilty leaders were executed, it would be normal to expect only a brief reference. Now, for the story, the reasons for rejecting the story are the following. So he gives a whole laundry list of reasons, and I just pick, and I'm gonna just quote a few of them. Number one, as already stated above, the reference to the story in the Quran is extremely brief, and there's no indication whatsoever of the killing of a large number. Number two, the rule in Islam is to punish only those who were responsible for the sedition. Number three, to kill such a large number is diametrically opposed to the Islamic sense of justice and to the basic principle laid down in the Quran, particularly the verse, "No soul shall bear another's burden." It is obvious in the story that the leaders were numbered and were all well known. They were named. Number four, it is also against the Quranic rule regarding prisoners of war, which is either they are to be granted their freedom or else they are allowed to be ransomed. Number five, it is unlikely that the Banu Qurayzah should be slaughtered when other Jewish groups who surrendered before Banu Qurayzah and after them were treated leniently and allowed to go. Indeed, Abu Ubaid ibn Salam relates in his Kitab al-Amwal that when Khaybar fell to the Muslims, there were among the residents a particular family or clan who had distinguished themselves by excessive, unseemly abuse of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Yet, in that hour, the Prophet addressed them in words which are no more than a rebuke. Quote, "Sons of Abul Huqayq," he said to them, "I have known the extent of your hostility to God and His Messenger. Yet that does not prevent me from treating you as I treated your brethren." That was after the surrender of Banu Qurayzah. Number six, if indeed so many hundreds of people had actually been put to death in the marketplace and trenches were dug for the operation, it is very strange that there should be no trace whatsoever of all that. No sign or word to point to the place, and no reference to a visible mark. Number seven, had this slaughter actually happened, jurists would have adopted it as a precedent. In fact, exactly the opposite has been the case. The attitude of jurists and their ruling have been more according to the Quranic rule, which says, "No soul shall bear another's burden." Number eight, in the story of Banu Qurayzah, a few specific persons were named as having been put to death, some of whom were described as particularly active in their hostility. It is the reasonable conclusion that those were the ones who led the sedition and who were consequently punished, not the whole tribe. Number nine, other details are difficult to accept. How could so many hundreds of persons be incarcerated in the house belonging to a woman of Banu Najjar? Then the author goes with additional points. So then, the real source of this unacceptable story of slaughter was the descendants of the Jews of Medina, from whom Ibn Ishaq took these odd tales. For doing so, Ibn Ishaq was severely criticized. The sources of the story are, therefore, extremely doubtful, and the details are too diametrically opposed to the spirit of Islam and the rules of the Quran to make the story credible. Credible authority is lacking, and circumstantial evidence does not support it. Then he adds, this means that the story is more than doubtful. However, the story, in my view, he's talking about himself, has its origin in earlier events. It can be shown that it reproduces similar stories which survived from the accounts of Jewish rebellion against the Romans, which ended in the destruction of the temple in the year 73 AD. The flight of the Jewish zealots and Sicarii to the rock fortress of Masada and the final liquidation of the besieged. Stories of their experience were naturally transmitted by Jewish survivors who fled south. Indeed, one of the more plausible theories of the origin of the Jews of Medina is that they came after the Jewish wars. This was the theory preferred by the late Professor Guillaume. As is well known, the source of the detail of the Jewish wars is Flavius Josephus, himself a Jew and a contemporary witness who held office under the Romans, but who nevertheless never ceased to be a Jew at heart. It is in his writings that we read of details which are closely similar to those transmitted to us in the Sirah about the actions and the resistance of the Jews, except that now we see the responsibility for the actions placed on the Muslims. In considering details of the story of Banu Qurayzah as told by descendants of the tribe, we may note the following similar details in the account of Josephus. Number 1, according to Josephus, Alexander, who ruled Jerusalem before Herod the Great, hung upon crosses 800 Jewish captives and slaughtered their wives and children before their eyes. Number 2, similarly, large number were killed by others. Number 3, important details of the two stories are remarkably similar, particularly the numbers of those killed. At Masada, the numbers of those who died at the end was 960. The hot-headed Sicarii, who were eventually also killed, numbered 600. We also read that when they reached the point of despair, they were addressed by their leader Eleazar, precisely as Ka'b ibn Asad addressed the Banu Qurayzah, who suggested to them the killing of their women and children. At the ultimate point of complete despair, the plan of killing each other to the last man was proposed. Clearly, the similarity of details is most striking. Not only are the suggestions of mass suicide similar, but even the numbers are almost the same. Even the same names occur in both accounts. There is indeed more than a mere similarity. Then he goes on, here we have the prototype. Indeed, I would suggest the origin of the story of Banu Qurayzah, preserved by descendants of the Jews who fled south to Arabia after the Jewish wars, just as Josephus recorded the same story for the classical world. A later generation of these descendants superimposed details of the siege of Masada on the story of siege of Banu Qurayzah, perhaps by confusing a tradition of their distant past with one from less remote history. The mixture provided Ibn Ishaq's story. When Muslim historians ignored it or transmitted it without comment or with cold lack of interest, they only expressed lack of enthusiasm for a strange tale, as Ibn Hajar called it. The author then relates, one last point, since the above was first written, means his paper, I have seen reports of a paper given in August 1973 at the World Congress of Jewish Studies, by Dr. Trudy Weiss Rosmarin, in which she challenges Josephus' assertion that 960 besieged Jews committed suicide at Masada. This is highly interesting since in the story of Qurayzah, the 960 or so Jews refused to commit suicide. Who knows, perhaps the story of Banu Qurayzah is an even more accurate form of the original version. You can find more details by studying the full paper along with all references in the footnote of each page. Again, the paper is titled New Light on the Story of Banu Qurayzah and the Jews of Medina, from the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of the Great Britain and Ireland, number 2, 1976, pages 100 through 107, published by Cambridge University Press. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.